All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into dealing with loss.
Okay.
We've got a great article called How Can You Overcome the Loss of a Loved One?
Mm-hmm.
And also a podcast episode that's exploring this topic from a faith-based perspective.
Interesting.
And one thing that really jumped out at me from the article was this quote from Pastor Selvaraj Rajia's son. After his father's passing, he said,
Okay.
"Dad is not gone. It's just as if he lived one floor above."
Wow.
Such a unique way to look at loss, right?
It is, yeah. Instead of, it's not about the absence, it's like the connection is still there, but just in a different form. It makes you think about how relationships can continue even when somebody's not physically present.
It really does. It changes how you think about it.
Yeah.
The article also talks about how important it is to let ourselves be comforted,
Okay.
even by people who haven't gone through the same kind of loss. And it even uses this example of like Jesus, offering compassion to sick people, even though he'd never been sick himself.
That's a good point. Yeah, it just shows that you don't necessarily have to have the same experience to
Yeah.
feel empathy or offer compassion.
Yeah.
Just being there for somebody, listening to them, that can be incredibly comforting in itself.
Absolutely. Have you ever felt that, like that gap?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There are times when I've wanted to comfort someone, but I was worried that because I haven't had the same experience,
Yeah.
I wouldn't really understand what they were going through.
I think we've all been there, like at some point.
Absolutely.
So how do we bridge that gap?
Yeah.
How can we offer genuine comfort even when we haven't had that exact same experience?
That's a good question. It might start with acknowledging that we don't fully understand what the other person's going through, but still being open to hearing about their experience. It's about validating their feelings and being there for them without trying to impose our own solutions.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
And this idea of letting go is another key point from the article.
Okay.
Obviously not forgetting the person, but more about releasing the pain
Right.
of them not being physically there
Right.
while still holding onto their memory in your heart.
Okay.
Makes me think of that quote from Pastor Rajia's son again. It's like a mature
Yeah.
acceptance of the situation,
Yeah.
but you're still connected in a way.
Yeah. When they talk about letting go in this context, it doesn't mean erasing the past or pretending the relationship wasn't important. It's more about finding a way to honor the love that you shared without getting overwhelmed by the pain of the physical separation.
Right.
And it's different for everybody.
It is. It's so personal.
Yeah.
Now, the podcast episode, it kind of takes a different approach, more faith-based.
Okay.
And it emphasizes the importance of talking about faith with family members
Okay.
so that they can have that hope of an afterlife.
Okay.
They even mentioned a specific verse, 1 Thessalonians 4.13, where Paul's talking about not grieving, as others do who have no hope.
That raises an interesting point about how faith and spirituality can change how we view death and give us comfort when we experience loss. It doesn't mean ignoring the pain or pretending it's not there.
Right.
It's about finding strength and hope from something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction.
Yeah.
And then the podcast goes on to give some practical steps for dealing with grief.
Okay.
Like prayer, journaling, having that community support, and understanding that grief doesn't always follow a straight line.
Right.
There are ups and downs, good days, bad days. What about you? What resonates with you most from those suggestions?
For me personally, journaling has always been a really helpful way to process my emotions, especially the difficult ones.
Yeah.
There's something about writing things down, getting those jumbled thoughts out of my head and onto paper that helps me process them in a healthier way.
Yeah.
It's like creating a space where I can be totally honest with myself without feeling judged.
Do you think the actual act of writing, like physically writing,
Oh, yeah, definitely.
adds something to that?
I think so. There's something about the physical act of putting pen to paper that helps me release those emotions instead of keeping them bottled up inside. It's like a way of letting go, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, yeah, like making it tangible.
Yeah, exactly.
And the podcast, they also highlighted how much comfort and strength we can get from Scripture.
Yeah.
They specifically mentioned Psalm 23.4, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." And then also Revelation 1.4, which talks about a future where God wipes away every tear and there is no more death or mourning or pain.
Powerful verses. They offer so much comfort and hope, especially when we're dealing with such intense grief. It's a reminder that even when things feel really dark, we're not alone. There's something bigger than us. a source of strength and comfort that goes beyond our current circumstances.
Yeah. And that sense of hope, it's a theme in both the article and the podcast.
Yeah.
They both acknowledge how painful loss is.
Right?
But they also encourage us to find ways to deal with that pain without being completely consumed by it.
Yeah.
Whether it's through faith or having support from others
Yeah.
or finding healthy ways to cope, the message is that there is a path forward,
Yeah.
even when it feels impossible to see.
Right. And it's also important to remember that healing doesn't necessarily mean forgetting or
Right.
like getting over the loss.
Yeah.
It's more about finding a way to kind of integrate that loss into our lives.
Yeah.
To carry the memory of the person with us in a way that lets us keep growing and evolving.
Yeah. And it's a journey, right?
It is.
It's not a straight line.
It's messy. Yeah. It's unpredictable. There'll be good days, bad days,
Right.
moments of peace, and then moments of intense pain. Absolutely. Both of these sources really highlight that it's okay to not be okay.
Right. And, one thing that I found interesting in the article was how it said that sometimes when we're deep in grief,
Yeah.
we might instinctively kind of push away comfort from people who haven't experienced the same type of loss.
Right. Like we feel like they couldn't possibly understand.
Yeah. Like you don't get it.
Exactly.
But then the article goes on to make this really interesting comparison.
Okay.
It points out that even Jesus,
Yeah.
in his earthly life, he didn't experience physical illness
Right.
or the death of a loved one,
Right.
but he still offered so much compassion to those who were suffering.
That's a really interesting point.
It is. It makes you think, right?
It does. It makes you rethink the whole idea that you need to have that same experience to feel genuine compassion. It's more about that empathy, being able to step outside of your own limited experience. Yeah.
And really connect with another person's pain.
Which brings us back to that question we talked about before.
Yeah.
How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah. How do you offer support to someone who's grieving when you haven't walked in their shoes?
Exactly.
I think it starts with just being there for them. Listening without judgment, not trying to offer advice or fix things.
Right.
Sometimes just acknowledging their pain and letting them know they're not alone is the most powerful thing you can do.
Yeah. And the podcast episode also brings up the importance of community support. Encouraging people to lean on their church or support groups or even just close friends and family during times of grief.
Having that support network makes a huge difference.
It does.
Because grief can be incredibly isolating.
Right.
So connecting with others who understand what you're going through, even if their experience is different, can make you feel less alone.
And it gives you that safe space to talk about those really raw emotions.
Right. Exactly. Without feeling judged.
Speaking of safe spaces, the podcast also talked about the role of prayer during grief.
Yeah.
Encouraging listeners to talk to God about everything they're feeling, the pain, the doubts, the questions, all of it.
It's that connection with something bigger than ourselves
Yeah.
that we were talking about before.
Right. It's about seeking comfort and guidance when you feel lost and alone.
And it doesn't have to be some formal, structured prayer.
Right.
It can be as simple as talking to God like you'd talk to a friend.
Exactly.
Sharing your burdens and looking for comfort.
Yeah.
Both the article and the podcast really stress that there's no quick fix for grief.
No, definitely not.
It's a journey, and it takes time.
And it's going to have its ups and downs.
Yeah.
There will be times when you feel like you're making progress and times when the grief feels just as heavy as ever. It's all part of the process.
But even with those ups and downs, both of these sources offer a message of hope.
Yes.
Hope that healing is possible, that the pain will lessen over time,
Right.
and that the love we shared with the people we've lost will continue to shape our lives.
And that's where that idea of letting go comes back in. It's not about forgetting or erasing the memory of the person,
Yeah.
but finding a way to carry their memory with us
Yeah.
in a way that lets us keep living and loving.
That takes us right back to that quote from Pastor Rajia's son.
Yeah.
Dad is not gone. It's just as if he lived one floor above.
Yeah. That's such a beautiful way to think about it.
It is.
It really speaks to how powerful love and connection can be, even when someone's not physically there anymore.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how relationships can go beyond our earthly experience.
It makes me think about the difference between moving on from grief
Yeah.
and moving forward with it.
That's a great distinction.
Moving on kind of sounds like you're leaving something behind.
Right.
But moving forward means you're carrying it with you as you grow and change.
It's about integrating that experience into your life
Yeah.
as you continue to move forward.
And that feels a lot more hopeful and realistic, right?
Absolutely.
It acknowledges that the loss is permanent,
Yeah.
but it also says that healing and growth are still possible.
Yeah, exactly. It's about finding a way to honor the past
Mm.
while embracing the present and moving towards the future,
Yeah.
carrying the love and the lessons with you along the way.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I think the main takeaway is that grief is a deeply personal and complex journey.
Absolutely. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
What works for one person might not work for another.
Right. And it's crucial to be patient with yourself.
Yeah.
And allow yourself to feel whatever comes up
Mm-hmm.
and to ask for help when you need it.
Yes. Don't be afraid to reach out for support.
There's no shame in that.
You don't have to go through this alone.
And even in our darkest moments,
Yeah.
we're not alone in this.
No. We're all connected in this human experience.
It's something we all go through.
Mm-hmm.
And in that shared experience, there's strength, resilience, and hope.
Beautifully said. Now, before we finish up this conversation about loss,
Okay.
let's talk about some specific things we can do
Jay.
to move forward and embrace that healing process.
Okay, so for this last part of our deep dive on loss, let's talk about some practical steps we can take to move towards healing.
Yeah, good idea. And I think it's good to remind ourselves again that healing doesn't mean forgetting the person, right?
Right.
It's not about replacing them. It's about finding a way to honor their memory
Yeah.
while also allowing ourselves to keep living our lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The article makes this comparison to physical illness. Like, we naturally want to help someone who's sick.
Yeah.
Even if we've never had that same illness ourselves,
Right.
it's about seeing their pain and wanting to comfort them,
Yeah.
regardless of whether we've been through it too.
Exactly. And that same idea applies to grief. Just because you haven't had the exact same loss as someone doesn't mean you can't support them.
Yeah.
Sometimes just being present, listening without judgment, being there for them to cry on
Yeah.
can make all the difference.
So true. So if you're going through loss, don't be afraid to reach out to people around you.
Yeah.
Tell them what you need, whether it's just someone to listen or a shoulder to cry on, or even just to sit with you quietly.
Yeah. And for those of us who want to support someone who's grieving,
Yeah.
sometimes the simplest things can mean the most.
Absolutely.
A phone call, a text, bringing them a meal. Those small gestures can really make someone feel seen and cared for.
Right. Especially when they might be feeling isolated and overwhelmed.
Exactly.
The podcast episode also had some good advice about finding healthy ways to cope.
Yeah.
They talked about journaling, spending time in nature, doing things that bring you joy.
Mm-hmm. Things that help you take care of yourself mentally, emotionally, and even physically.
Yeah, it's so easy to forget about self-care when you're grieving, but it's so important. Making sure you're eating well, getting enough sleep, moving your body, it can really help you handle the stress of grief.
Absolutely.
And they also reminded us that grief isn't a straight line.
Right. Yeah.
You'll have good days and bad days.
Yeah.
And it's important to let yourself feel those emotions, whatever they are,
Mm-hmm.
without judging yourself or expecting things to happen on a certain timeline.
Yeah, you can't force yourself to get over it.
Right.
Or follow some schedule for healing. Grief is a journey, and it's different for everyone.
Exactly. And the podcast also talked about finding meaning in loss, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
They suggested asking yourself questions like, what did I learn from this person?
Mm-hmm.
Or how can I honor their memory in a way that feels meaningful? It's about taking that pain and turning it into something positive.
Yeah. Taking something that could break you and using it to inspire you to live a more meaningful life.
Exactly. And both sources talked about the importance of faith in the healing process,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's through prayer or going to religious services or just feeling connected to something bigger than yourself.
Yeah.
Faith can be a source of comfort, strength, and hope, especially when things are tough.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that there's no one right way to practice faith.
Right.
What matters is finding what works for you,
Yeah.
what helps you feel connected to your own sense of spirituality.
Right. So as we wrap up our deep dive into loss, I think we've covered a lot of ground. It's a tough topic,
Yeah, it is.
but hopefully we've given our listeners some things to think about, some
Yes.
ideas for how to navigate through grief.
Absolutely. If you had to sum it up, what would be your one piece of advice for someone dealing with loss?
I would say, remember that you're not alone in this.
Yeah.
Grief is something we all go through as humans.
It's part of the human experience.
And in that shared experience, there's strength, resilience, and hope. Let yourself feel your emotions. Don't be afraid to reach out for support. And find those sources of comfort and meaning that work for you.
Well said. And remember that the love we shared with those we've lost will never truly disappear.
Yeah.
It lives on in our hearts, our memories, and the ways we choose to honor their lives. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope you found it helpful and maybe even a little bit comforting.